My husband ordered me to empty our bank accounts. 3 days later, my son exposed the truth. The last thing my husband said before leaving our house was, "Trust me, Sarah. If you love this family, move every dollar before it's too late." At the time, I believed he was trying to save us. 3 days later, my 16-year-old son walked into my kitchen, looked me in the eyes, and said something that shattered 18 years of marriage in a single sentence. "Mom, Dad lied to you." Looking back now, that was the moment my entire life split into two different versions. There was the life before I learned the truth, and there was everything that came after. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 42 years old, and until that week, I thought I knew exactly who my husband was. Robert and I had been married for 18 years. We had built a comfortable life together, raised a wonderful son, paid off most of our mortgage, and slowly filled our savings accounts with the kind of security that comes from years of hard work and sacrifice. We weren't rich, but we were stable. At least that's what I thought. Then one Tuesday evening, Robert came home looking like a man who had seen a ghost. The second he walked through the front door, I knew something was wrong. His face was pale, his shirt was damp with sweat, and his hands wouldn't stop shaking. He barely acknowledged Ethan before pulling me upstairs and closing the bedroom door behind us. For several seconds, he just sat on the edge of the bed staring at the floor. I kept asking what happened, but he wouldn't answer. Finally, he looked up at me with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't anger, it wasn't sadness, it was fear, real fear, the kind that instantly makes the people around you afraid too. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I need you to do something tomorrow morning, and I need you to do it exactly the way I tell you." My stomach tightened. "What's going on?" I asked. He rubbed his face and took a long breath. "Our money isn't safe." I stared at him, confused. "What do you mean?" He explained that there were serious problems at his company. According to him, lawyers were getting involved. There could be investigations, frozen accounts, and lawsuits. He claimed innocent families might get caught in the middle. He said he had received information from someone he trusted and that we needed to move our money immediately before it was too late. The more he talked, the more terrified he sounded. Every sentence seemed to make the situation worse. By the time he finished, my hands were shaking too. "What do we do?" I asked. Without hesitation, he looked directly into my eyes and said, "Tomorrow morning, empty every joint account we have, move everything." The words hit me like a punch. Everything? Our checking account, our savings, Ethan's college fund, our emergency reserve, every dollar we had spent years building? Robert nodded firmly. Every dollar. I wanted to ask more questions, but fear has a way of silencing common sense. This was my husband, the man I had trusted for nearly 2 decades. Why would I doubt him? The next morning, I followed his instructions. For hours, I sat in front of my computer transferring money from one account to another. By lunchtime, almost every cent we owned had been moved into an account Robert personally provided. When I called him to confirm it was done, he sounded relieved. Almost too relieved. "Good," he said quickly. "You did the right thing." Something about his tone felt strange, but I pushed the feeling aside. I told myself we were protecting our family. Over the next 2 days, Robert became increasingly distant. He spent hours on his phone. He stepped outside to take private calls. He barely spoke during dinner. Several times I caught him smiling at messages before quickly locking his screen when I entered the room. Whenever I asked if everything was okay, he blamed stress. I wanted to believe him. After all, I had already trusted him with everything we owned. Then came Friday morning. Robert packed a suitcase, kissed the top of my head, and told me he had to leave town for business. There was something strange about the goodbye. He hugged Ethan for barely a second. He avoided eye contact with me, and when I asked when he would return, he simply said soon. Then he got into his car and drove away. I stood at the window watching his vehicle disappear down the street, feeling a sense of dread I couldn't explain. 3 days passed, no calls, no messages, no updates. Every excuse I made for him felt weaker than the one before. Then, on the third evening, Ethan walked into the kitchen while I was making dinner. His face was pale, his eyes were filled with worry. "Mom," he said quietly. I turned toward him. "What is it?" He hesitated for a moment before swallowing hard. Then he said 7 words that changed my life forever. "Mom, Dad lied about everything." The wooden spoon slipped from my hand and crashed onto the floor. My heart stopped beating for what felt like several seconds. Because the look on my son's face told me he wasn't guessing, he wasn't assuming. Somehow my son knew something about my husband that I didn't, and whatever it was about to destroy everything I thought I knew about the man I married. I stared at Ethan, waiting for him to explain what he meant. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound in the kitchen was the ticking of the clock on the wall. My heart was pounding so hard that I could barely hear anything else. Ethan had always been a calm, thoughtful kid. He wasn't the type to make dramatic accusations or jump to conclusions. If he was standing in front of me looking that terrified, then whatever he knew had to be serious. "What do you mean Dad lied?" I finally asked. Ethan glanced nervously toward the hallway as if he expected someone to overhear us, even though we were alone. Then he took a deep breath and sat down at the kitchen table. 3 days before Dad left, I heard him talking on the phone, he said quietly. At first I wasn't trying to listen, I was upstairs doing homework, but then I heard him say your name. My stomach tightened instantly. Ethan explained that he had been walking downstairs when he heard Robert speaking in a low voice in his home office. The door wasn't completely closed. At first, Ethan assumed it was a work call. Then he heard Robert laughing. Not the nervous laugh of a stressed businessman, the relaxed laugh of someone enjoying a private conversation. Ethan paused before continuing. He told someone that everything was going according to plan. A cold chill ran through my body. What plan? I asked. Ethan shook his head. I don't know. But then he said something else. He looked down at the table. He said you still believed every word he told you. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My mind immediately went back to that night in our bedroom. The fear in Robert's eyes, the shaking hands, the desperate warnings. Had all of it been an act? Ethan continued speaking. The next day, he accidentally overheard another conversation. This time, Robert wasn't talking about work. He was talking about money, a lot of money. According to Ethan, he heard Robert tell the person on the phone that once the transfers were complete, they would finally be free to move forward. Free to move forward. The phrase repeated itself in my head. None of it made sense. If Robert was genuinely trying to protect our family, why would he be speaking like that? Why would he be discussing secret plans with someone else? Then Ethan said something that made my blood run cold. Mom, I don't think Dad was talking to a business partner. I stared at him. What do you mean? Ethan hesitated again. I think he was talking to another woman. The room suddenly felt smaller. I wanted to reject the idea immediately. I wanted to tell myself there had to be another explanation. But deep down, something inside me already knew where this was heading. The strange behavior, the private phone calls, the disappearing money, the sudden business trip. When I looked back at the past 6 months, I realized there had been warning signs everywhere. I had simply chosen not to see them. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. There's more. My pulse quickened. More? He nodded. After I overheard those conversations, I got suspicious. He opened a recording app and handed me the phone. The next day, I recorded part of another call. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen. Then I pressed play. The recording was slightly distorted, but Robert's voice was unmistakable. I felt my entire body freeze as I listened. Once the money is moved, there won't be anything tying me down anymore, Robert said. A woman's voice laughed softly on the other end. And what about your wife? She asked. There was a brief pause, then my husband answered. Sarah won't know what happened until it's too late. My hands started shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. The recording continued. The woman asked if he was sure everything would work. Robert laughed. Trust me, she believes every word I tell her. The audio ended. For several seconds, I couldn't move. 18 years of marriage flashed through my mind. Every anniversary, every family vacation, every promise, every sacrifice. Suddenly, all of it felt like a lie. Ethan looked devastated. I'm sorry, Mom. Tears filled my eyes, but I forced myself to stay calm. This wasn't the time to fall apart. If the recording was real, and I knew it was, then Robert hadn't moved our money to protect us. He had moved it because he was planning something. Something that involved another woman. Something that involved leaving us behind. Then another realization hit me. The account where I had transferred all our money wasn't in our names. It was an account Robert had provided at the last minute. At the time, I hadn't questioned it because I trusted him. Now I realized how stupid that trust had been. My hands were trembling as I logged into our banking accounts. What I found nearly stopped my heart. The account balance was zero. Every dollar was gone, not transferred again, gone. The account itself had been emptied less than 24 hours earlier. I felt the room spin around me. Robert hadn't simply lied. He had stolen everything we had spent 18 years building. But the worst part wasn't losing the money. The worst part was realizing that while I was sitting there trying to understand what happened, my husband was somewhere else with another woman, believing he had gotten away with it. What Robert didn't know was that his own son had just exposed him, and before this was over, he was about to discover that stealing our money was the biggest mistake of his life. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Robert's voice from the recording. Sarah won't know what happened until it's too late. Those words replayed in my head over and over until sunrise. By morning, the shock had started turning into something else, anger. For 3 days, I had been sitting at home worried about my husband, wondering if he was safe, wondering if our family was in danger. Meanwhile, he had been planning his escape. The man I had trusted with my entire life had manipulated me into helping him steal everything we owned. The more I thought about it, the more determined I became. Robert believed he had already won. He believed he had taken the money and disappeared without leaving a trail. What he didn't realize was that he had underestimated 2 people, his wife and his son. The next morning, Ethan and I sat together at the dining room table reviewing everything we knew. For the first time, I treated the situation like an investigation instead of a marriage crisis. We wrote down dates, transactions, unusual behavior, phone calls, and anything else that seemed important. Once I started connecting the dots, a pattern became impossible to ignore. About 7 months earlier, Robert's behavior had begun changing. He became protective of his phone. He started traveling more often. Business dinners suddenly became overnight trips. At the time, I accepted every explanation because I trusted him. Now, those explanations looked very different. Then Ethan remembered something important. About 2 months earlier, he had seen a name appear on Robert's phone several times. At the time, it meant nothing. Now it felt significant. The name was Lauren, he said. I remember because she kept calling while we were watching a movie. My stomach tightened. I immediately searched through old phone records connected to our account. It took hours, but eventually I found what I was looking for. The same number appeared dozens of times over the previous 6 months. Sometimes late at night, sometimes early in the morning, sometimes multiple times a day. Whoever Lauren was, she wasn't just a casual acquaintance. I decided to call the number. My hands shook as I dialed. The phone rang twice before a woman answered. "Hello?" she said. For a moment I couldn't speak. Then I introduced myself. There was complete silence on the other end, a silence that lasted long enough to tell me everything I needed to know. Before I could ask another question, the woman hung up. My heart sank. That single reaction confirmed what I had feared. Lauren knew exactly who I was, and if she knew who I was, then she almost certainly knew who Robert was too. Within an hour, I received another shock. One of my closest friends worked in real estate, and after hearing what happened, she offered to help me search public records. We weren't expecting much. Then she called me back with information that made my blood run cold. 6 weeks earlier, Robert had signed a lease on a luxury apartment across town. The lease wasn't in his name alone. A second name appeared beside it. Lauren Matthews. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. While I was planning our future, Robert had been building another life. While I was helping Ethan prepare for college applications, Robert had been secretly furnishing an apartment for another woman. The betrayal felt endless. Every answer seemed to uncover an even uglier truth. But then something happened that changed everything. That afternoon, Ethan walked into the living room carrying his laptop. His face looked pale. "Mom," he said quietly, "you need to see this." He turned the screen toward me. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then I noticed the social media profile. It belonged to Lauren. My pulse immediately quickened. The profile was mostly private, but several photos were visible. In one picture, Lauren stood in front of a luxury hotel. In another, she was sitting beside a swimming pool holding a glass of champagne. Then I saw the photograph that made my stomach drop. Lauren was standing beside Robert. His arm was around her waist. Both of them were smiling directly at the camera. The image had been uploaded almost 3 months earlier. 3 months earlier, I had been sitting across from my husband celebrating our wedding anniversary. The room spun around me. Ethan looked away, unable to watch my reaction. I wanted to cry. I wanted to scream. Instead, I forced myself to stay calm, because something else had just become clear. Robert hadn't simply fallen into an affair. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a moment of weakness. He had been planning this for months, maybe even years. The fake financial emergency, the secret account, the stolen savings, the hidden apartment, every piece fit together perfectly. This wasn't chaos. It was strategy, and that realization terrified me more than anything else. If Robert had planned this so carefully, then what else was he hiding? That question was answered later that evening when my phone rang unexpectedly. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it. Something told me not to. The second I answered, I heard a nervous female voice. "Sarah?" she asked. I immediately recognized her. It was Lauren. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she said something I never expected to hear. "I think Robert lied to both of us." My heart nearly stopped. Before I could respond, Lauren continued. "There are things you don't know, and after what I discovered this morning, I think we need to meet." Suddenly, everything changed. Because if Lauren was telling the truth, then Robert's affair wasn't the biggest secret in this story. It was only the beginning, and whatever Lauren had discovered was serious enough to make her turn against the man she had helped destroy my marriage for. The moment Lauren said, "I think Robert lied to both of us," I felt a strange mix of anger, confusion, and disbelief. For months, I had imagined the woman who helped destroy my marriage as my enemy. Now she was calling me, sounding just as betrayed as I felt. Part of me wanted to hang up immediately. Another part needed answers. We agreed to meet the following morning at a small coffee shop on the other side of town. That night, I barely slept. My mind kept racing through every possibility. What secret could be so important that it made Lauren turn against the man she had chosen over me? By the time I arrived at the coffee shop, my stomach was tied in knots. Lauren was already there. She looked nothing like the confident woman from the photos. She seemed exhausted, pale, and genuinely frightened. The moment I sat down, she pushed a thick folder across the table. "Before you say anything," she whispered, "I need you to know I didn't know the truth." I stared at her silently. Then she opened the folder. Inside were financial records, contracts, emails, and copies of transactions. As I reviewed the documents, the full extent of Robert's deception finally became clear. He hadn't just lied to me. He hadn't just lied to Lauren. He had been lying to everyone. According to the records, the money he convinced me to transfer wasn't intended for a new life with Lauren. In fact, Lauren had no idea the money even existed. Robert had told her he was wealthy from investments and business deals. The reality was very different. Nearly every dollar he claimed to own had come from our joint accounts. Worse, the apartment lease Lauren believed he was paying for himself had actually been funded using money that legally belonged to me. But the biggest shock came from the final document in the folder. Robert had been communicating with overseas financial consultants about moving assets out of the country. His plan wasn't simply to leave his wife. His plan was to disappear completely. Once he secured enough money, he intended to leave both of us behind. Lauren wasn't his future. She was just another victim. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. We simply sat there staring at the evidence. Then Lauren began crying. Through tears, she explained how she discovered the truth. The previous day, Robert had suddenly stopped answering her calls. Concerned, she visited the apartment. When she arrived, she found it nearly empty. Several expensive items were gone. His personal belongings had disappeared. Even the artwork had been removed from the walls. At first, she assumed he was traveling. Then she found an email accidentally left open on his laptop. The email detailed plans for an international transfer and included a message from Robert discussing how neither woman would be able to stop him once he was gone. Reading those words had shattered her. For the first time, she realized she had never been special. She had simply been useful. What Robert didn't know was that his carefully constructed plan was already collapsing. While he was busy preparing his escape, several people were working against him. Lauren handed over everything she had. Ethan provided the recordings. I provided the financial records. Together, we took the evidence directly to an attorney and financial investigators. Once professionals reviewed the documents, events moved quickly. Accounts were frozen. Authorities were notified. Several transactions were flagged for investigation. Robert had spent months creating an elaborate scheme, but he never considered one simple possibility, that the people he manipulated might eventually compare notes. For the first time, he wasn't controlling the narrative anymore. 3 weeks later, Robert finally contacted me. The call came late at night. When I answered, I immediately recognized the panic in his voice. He knew something was wrong. Several of his transfers had been blocked. Financial institutions were asking questions. The money he thought was safely hidden was suddenly out of reach. "Sarah, listen to me," he said urgently. "There's been a misunderstanding." I almost laughed. A misunderstanding? After 18 years of lies, affairs, manipulation, and theft. That was the best explanation he could offer. He spent nearly 20 minutes talking, blaming everyone except himself. He blamed stress. He blamed business pressures. He blamed bad advice. He even blamed Lauren. Yet somehow the one person he never blamed was the man responsible for everything. When he finally finished, I asked him a simple question. "Did you ever love me?" The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Then he answered quietly, "Of course I did." For the first time during the entire conversation, I believed he was telling the truth. The tragedy was that love wasn't the problem. His selfishness was. Several months later, the divorce was finalized. Much of the stolen money was recovered through legal action, some of it wasn't. But by then, I had stopped measuring my future in dollars. The real victory wasn't financial, it was freedom. For the first time in years, I no longer lived with lies. Ethan and I moved into a smaller home and started rebuilding our lives. It wasn't easy. There were difficult days. There were moments when the betrayal still hurt, but there was also peace, real peace, the kind that comes when you finally stop carrying someone else's deception on your shoulders. Meanwhile, Robert's life continued unraveling. Friends distanced themselves. Business relationships disappeared. The people he manipulated no longer trusted him. One by one, the foundations of his carefully constructed world collapsed. Nearly a year later, I received a letter from him. Inside was a handwritten apology. Not the kind written by someone trying to avoid consequences, but the kind written by someone who finally understands them. He admitted that greed had blinded him. He admitted that he spent so much time chasing a fantasy that he failed to appreciate what he already had. He admitted that losing Ethan's respect hurt more than losing money. At the end of the letter, he wrote a sentence I will never forget. Asterisk, I thought I was escaping my old life. I didn't realize I was running away from the only people who ever truly cared about me. When I finished reading the letter, I folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. Then I walked outside and watched my son laughing with friends in our backyard. In that moment, I realized something important. Robert believed the money was the most valuable thing he was taking when he emptied our accounts. He was wrong. The most valuable thing he lost was his family. And unlike money, trust isn't something you can earn back once you've spent it all. My husband ordered me to empty our bank accounts because he thought he was stealing our future. What he never expected was that 72 hours later, his own son would expose the truth and destroy the lie that cost him everything.